Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Themes and Variations, the Aldous Huxley podcast. This is a special episode in which I'm joined by Heike Sieger. Heike graduated from Münster University with an MA in English, German, and Russian literature in 2006. Today, we're going to talk about her work more recently, where she came back to Münster to do a PhD in 2023 and published a dissertation as a book entitled Music as Satire in Aldous Huxley's Utopian Works in the Human Potentiality series, which is published by the University of Münster with Lit Verlag. She's also published various essays in Aldous Huxley and collaborated with the Aldous Huxley Society over the years. But today we're going to focus on the book. So welcome, Heike. Thank you for joining me. And please correct me if I got any of your bio egregiously wrong.
No, thanks. Everything's fine concerning my biography. Perfect summary. Thank you.
Fantastic. I wonder, before we dive into your new book, it's worth noting that you come to this project with a diverse background, both in literary scholarship, but also in journalism, and you also work with kind of high potential young people as well in your day job, as it were. So amidst all of this, what first drew you to the intersection of Huxley, satire, and music? And how did that decade-long research journey, since initially undertaking your MA, lead us to what eventually became Music as Satire?
Yeah, so I graduated in 2006 and I was working as a wedding journalist for 8 entire years, a time where I didn't have any contact to literary studies at all. But something seemed to have missed in my life somehow, I don't know. And after 8 years writing about all the white dresses and all the fancy stuff around weddings, I thought there must be more than this. And I recontacted Professor Bernfried Nugel, the supervisor of my dissertation and formerly of my master thesis. And we had a very nice talk in the Aldous Huxley Center in Münster about, is there any chance after 8 years to write a dissertation? And he said, oh, why not? And he even could remember a presentation I held in one of his classes. This, by the way, was my very first class where I got into contact with Aldous Huxley. It was a class about Ape and Essence and only on Ape and Essence. Very exciting for me because I read the weirdest book, I think, of Huxley's in my very first seminar on this. And I had a very long and extensive presentation on Huxley's choice of music in Ape and Essence. And he said, I remember this presentation. This was very interesting. Why can't you stick on music in Huxley's utopian works? Because we all know music in his all works have been published. There are studies about this topic by Kuipers and Cockshott. And no one really wanted to take a closer look at these 3 peculiar works before. And so I said, okay, I could do this. Firstly, it was music, literature, and the arts represented in the utopian novels, but we quite quickly realized, okay, there's so much in music. I don't want to write an encyclopedia or something. So let's stick to the musical topic and focus on that with references to literature and the arts where necessary. So I have Shelley in my analysis of Ape and Essence as well, because it's some kind of music, but maybe that's for a later stage of the interview.
Yeah, already so much to talk about, but so rich in your introduction. We'll provide links to those existing studies where they're available by Kuipers and Cockshott in the show notes, so everyone's aware of them. But yeah, it's really interesting that your first experience was reading this book, in essence. It is a very unusual book, isn't it? It's for people that are in any doubt that Huxley was quite an experimental writer. This is a really experimental text. It's
Yes.
framed as the discovery of a lost Hollywood film script, but then within that film script, there's this dystopian vision. But yeah, it continues this kind of this play of, is it a film script? Is it not a film script throughout? It's really quite bizarre, isn't it? So I think that's a really great introduction for you to Huxley.
Yes, I think so. I can remember when I was reading it in preparation for the class, and I just couldn't stop, which I consider not very usual if you are preparing for a university class. Honestly,
Hmm?
sometimes it was quite boring. Oh, I have to read all these books for my seminar. And this one was really outstanding. And I remember writing down notes on almost every page with all the references also to atomic incidents has hidden in this book. So I wanted to be well prepared, of course. And yeah, I love it till today, and I always find new aspects to analyze in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And you honed in from looking at the arts overall to looking specifically at music for your dissertation, which is what led to the book. And I was wondering, could you maybe just try to walk us through the main thesis, if it's possible to easily summarize? How does Huxley use music as a vehicle for satire in his three utopian novels that you look at? And why has this link been overlooked? I think it might also be worth just summarizing a bit about, for our viewers and listeners, what is a utopia? What is it versus a dystopia? And why do you refer to those three works, Brave New World, Island, and Ape and Essence, as utopian works?
First of all, I'm trying to stick to Huxley's own definition. He doesn't talk about utopia and dystopia, but utopia in positive and negative. So I think this leads to a little bit of freedom in interpreting it. And okay, dystopia sounds very brutal, I think. When thinking of dystopia, I'm thinking about George Orwell's 1984. But utopia, generally, no matter if positive or negative, we have always satirical aspects in this genre. So it's not only a futuristic outlook, maybe a very depressive one. It's so utopia should be a mirror of present day society.
Mm.
And of course, there are witty novels like this. We have Samuel Butler's Erewhon, which is a topsy-turvy portrait of Victorian society, but still set somewhere in the nowhere, in the future, wherever. So this, of course, is a utopian novel, but also a satire. So I'm afraid concerning Brave New World, most people read it as a futuristic fantasy, only as a utopia. The same happened to me. Then Professor Nugel came and said, Brave New World is a satire. I said, okay, I thought it's a utopia. No, it's both. So there we have the twist between the genre of utopia, positive, negative, and satire. But for some reason, I don't know, the scholars who previously worked about satire so much, Jerome Mackey, for instance, they focused only on satire and didn't link satire to the aspect of music. And the scholars concerned with music did the same for music, but there's maybe a hint here or there, oh yes, that's quite satirical, but they didn't try to show an overall concept, especially for the utopian novels. And Cockshott and Kupers, the two leading musicologists in this field, they were interested in music in the entire oeuvre. So they didn't want to limit on one special genre in this case. I think this is a reason why it's worth looking at this topic, of course. And Huxley uses different possibilities to have music in his works. So we have inconspicuous references, for instance, to composers or to certain works. So here I say brainy reader will have to guess, okay, how does it sound? Maybe this is a funny thing or not a funny thing. So Huxley, we know he was well educated and very fond of music. So he had a big knowledge of music, of course. And he requires a lot from his readers, doesn't he? So he thinks everybody will know how, let's say, the Bach's Fourth Brandenburg Concerto must sound like, or Wagner's Liebestod or whatever. So this is one part. He mentions music. Then he has renderings of musical terms, also a thing that requires a knowledge from the readers. So if he says something is like pianissimo or fortissimo, someone who has not any idea of music in production,
Mhm.
playing music himself, won't know what he's talking about. So this is difficult. But there are also fine renderings of music in the entire oeuvre. I'm coming back to Bach all the time, but the famous drug-taking scene in Ireland is one of his masterpieces in describing music in one of his novels, and it's showing how analytic his mind is. So these are some examples how and where we find music in Huxley's work.
Yeah, and I think it is absolutely true that he does ask a lot of his readers in terms of familiarity with different musical styles. It's not just music, of course, like different literary references as well. I would say, before we turn more specifically to this question of satire, if we think about the groundwork that Gerald Cockshott and Jean-Louis Coupers did in this area, he does have some really phenomenal descriptions of music itself. I'm thinking, as you have an account of in your book, Spandrel's experience of the so Beethoven, isn't it, in Point Counterpoint, where there's this discussion of what a kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, by the way, what a kind of fugal structure looks like with streams overlapping and each is a function of each other. And yeah, I do think there's quite a lot of strength of musical descriptiveness. So he does balance that difficulty of understanding the reference points with very strong descriptions of music. I don't know if that has something to do with his experience as a journalist for the Westminster Gazette, writing constantly about music and trying to give people a sense in words of what music is. So do you think that to some extent you're going to get like an education about music from reading Huxley as well as being challenged too?
I think reading Huxley really offers opportunity to get into touch with composers you would not listen to before, but not only his fiction. I'm thinking about the essays. So apart from all these critical essays for Westminster Gazette, we have so many of them dealing with music broadly. I don't recall all the titles precisely, honestly, but he wrote about fascist hymns, for example, extensively. His Gesualdo essay is very famous because he dwells into Gesualdo's music. And of course, I don't know who knows Gesualdo. Renaissance music now is more popular than in Huxley's time. So it was rediscovered, I think, about the 1950s onwards. So Huxley wrote a lot about this kind of music in his later years. I think it's an offer to discover classical music in a new sense, and hopefully to make your own opinion on music, because Huxley was sometimes a little highbrow concerning his musical taste, I have to admit. So I'm not happy with his denying of popular music and jazz music, for instance. So he had clearly musical dislikes and he utters them all the time. And sometimes I think it's not fair to declassify some of the more popular music he's writing about. But for him, it was like a kind of shallow entertainment. It wasn't, let's say, brainy enough for him. So he preferred something to have it in your brain, to analyze melodies, as you said, the streams of the violins and everything, the structure of a fugue. This was appealing him, but not some simple song with a refrain and the rest of the lyrics and repetition.
Hello, it's Emily, and I'll be bringing you a couple of Huxley-related segments today. I thought it would be interesting to start off with a discussion of Huxley and modernism. Namely, can we actually describe Aldous Huxley as a modernist writer? Huxley's writing career spanned from the 1920s all the way up to the 1960s, and during that time he associated with quite a few prominent modernists, or people who we would consider to be prominent modernist writers, such as Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, T.S. Eliot, to name but a few. But it's interesting to note that this label isn't actually so readily applied to Huxley himself. So I wanted to discuss maybe why that might be. I think to understand why, we have to first try to understand a little bit more about modernism and where it came from. I think that this is perhaps too big a discussion for a short segment, but I'm going to give it a go. Literary modernism can perhaps be best summed up by the following lines from W.B. Yeats's poem, The Second Coming. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. What this means is that modernists often search for a metaphysical centre or a certainty of reality or meaning, but instead experience its very collapse. Modernist writers writing in the wake of World War I and the disillusionment that followed started to break with this long-standing contract of the artist as a reliable witness to events. They instead developed more unreliable narratorial voices that exposed the irrationality at the core of a supposedly rational world. I think these writers were also, to varying degrees, inspired by advances in our understandings about psychology, politics, science, philosophy, influenced perhaps by thinkers such as Darwin, Freud, Jung, Einstein, Nietzsche, Bergson, to name but a few. From this developed innovative literary techniques such as stream of consciousness, interior monologue, as well as the use of multiple points of view. So in light of all of this, how is it that we can define literary modernism? I think we can perhaps boil this down to a few key elements. So we have stream of consciousness, fragmentation, experimentation with form, and psychological focus. So where perhaps does Huxley sit in all of this? I think in some respects he fits in very comfortably. If we take the example of Point Counterpoint, this is a novel that's fascinated by fragmentation of society, of knowledge, and indeed of the self. In Point Counterpoint, Huxley arranges characters almost musically, allowing competing philosophies to sound off against each other without granting any singular voice prominence. The polyphonic structure alongside the novel's shifting perspectives and self-conscious discussion of its own form, I feel is recognisably modernist. The point of that polyphony, I think, is also interesting because in his later novel, Brave New World, Huxley lays dialogues occurring at the same time on top of each other in a way that almost reflects the cubist approach of approaching the same object, indeed the same moment, from different angles. And I think for me, this represents the blending of forms that does characterise literary modernism. Huxley also shares the modernist preoccupation with an unstable identity. His characters are often divided between intellect and instinct, social performance, and private desire. In Antic Hay and Those Barren Leaves, individuals drift through a world of parties, fashions, theories, and technologies, searching for some sort of principle that might hold their experience of the world together. Like other modernists, Huxley presents modern life as overstimulating, disjointed, and spiritually uncertain. Yet for some, Huxley doesn't fit the category of modernists quite so readily. When we think about language, for example, specifically the stream of consciousness, Huxley rarely adapts words or syntax in order to really push at the boundaries of lucidity in writing. In fact, a lot of Huxley's novels, in terms of dialogue, they are incredibly lucid. In fact, you have characters delivering mini essays or sermons to each other to advance ideas. In a Huxleyan novel, you wouldn't experience the same kind of linguistic shape-shifting that occurs in novels such as those of Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, for example. Readers who define modernism through stream of consciousness, extreme formal difficulty, or the breakdown of conventional language might instead regard Huxley as peripheral to modernism rather than a key figure within that movement.
I'm thinking of Theodore Adorno's famous denunciation of jazz music around a similar time in the 1940s, 1950s, where he attacks jazz music, and this is seen by contemporary critics as proof that he is a fuddy-duddy, he's not in touch with popular culture. I think it does deserve some qualification, because when Huxley and Adorno are talking about jazz music, broadly they're talking about the closest equivalent to pop music of their day, when we think about jazz music, we probably think about Miles Davis, John Coltrane. We think about really impressive and experimental artists. When Huxley and Adorno are thinking about jazz music, they are thinking of taking maybe classical tunes or popular songs, adding syncopation to them, and then churning it out. So they're thinking of it's like this idea that how many Victorian novels do we not even know about because they were produced in huge quantities and then pulped because they were just garbage. Like there was a lot of music being produced and broadcast that we just don't really know about. So I think we can be a bit fairer to him. But it's true, he is highbrow. He is highbrow and he is challenging, and that's not necessarily a problem, is it? I think we could probably do with more highbrow tastes nowadays, potentially, to risk being described as a conservative myself.
Yes.
So I wanted to move on to a more concrete example. So in the book, you actually discuss at some length a topic for many people sounds utterly surprising, which is the fact that Huxley himself in the 1950s adapted his utopian work, to use a proper term, his negative utopia, to use an even properer term, Brave New World, as a musical comedy. Many listeners won't even know this text exists. What does your analysis of, tell us about the text, and what is your analysis of the kind of motifs and songs and romantic elements in this adaptation tell us about Huxley's use of music as a vehicle for satire? I was pretty, flabbergasted to learn about this musical comedy as well. It's really interesting.
Yeah, when I read it the first time, I was also very astonished because he made so many plot changes, first of all. But in my perception, it was okay, he wanted a public success, of course. And writing musical comedies is not that easy. And I think it was a good approach of him to make Brave New World, the novel, attractive for a Broadway audience. I think this is what he had in mind. Although his musical comedies were not really successful, he also wanted to create one of Ape and Essence as musical comedy with ballet even, but this was never realized for good reasons, I suppose. So
Good reasons then maybe, and it's certainly not the typical thing you would imagine as a Broadway or West End musical. But then if I think the kind of musicals we make now, like the Book of Mormon, that which are very confronting in terms of the content, he was way ahead of his time to try and make Ape and Essence, which is a text that features infanticide. It's really an extreme satire. That's pretty much Book of Mormon territory, isn't it? So...
yeah, that's true. Maybe there are people who would be interested to turn the theater version, the play of Ape and Essence, into a musical. Who knows? Getting back to Brave New World, I think his idea to make it attractive for a broader audience was also to poke fun on his own audience, to show them in what kind of shallow society they are still living, which is, I think, a little depressing. So it was like Brave New World was written in the 50s, not ages before. He saw the need, I think, to turn it into musical comedy, but he knew that it wouldn't work without a little romance, indeed. And we know the romance between Lenina and John was not very happy in the book. He wanted to provide them a classic happy end with a hideaway on Tahiti even. We can say, yes, let's say maybe stupid audience would really like it because we see how both worlds will come together. By the way, Lenina's name has changed, like other names in the musical comedy. Her name is Anina now, and she switches a little bit with Bernard Marx. So Bernard is happy that he has made discoveries and he becomes famous in the Brave New World. So he's a fully integrated member in the end. And Lenina is the one who chooses a life with a savage somewhere in the nowhere, namely Tahiti. And Huxley had the idea of leitmotifs simply to have something consistent in his soundtrack. I think it's how we know soundtracks nowadays work. Or any TV show works. So we have a catchy melody, for instance, and we connect it to some things. So he had an imaginary leitmotif for community identity stability in a hymn-like style, very orotund and pompous in style. Of course, that's important. And he wants a leitmotif for the loving couple. And of course, we know from the novel that John has all his ideas of romantic love from Shakespeare. So it's clear that Huxley didn't imagine any other style, but he is still wanted to have Renaissance style, and he uses music. He describes it in the style of the composer Dufay, a Renaissance composer. So I imagine John with a lute, something like bling, very romantic. Maybe Huxley had complete different ideas in mind. So I think music in Renaissance style provides a good contrast to Brave New World, of course, to the clearliness, to all this synthetic aspects of the Brave New World. And Jerome Mackey criticized in his afterword that there's no duet in the script, but I think that's not important. So why should Nina and John sing a duet? It's still two worlds that simply, I'm sure, can't unite in the end. But maybe this is an outlook for after the musical comedy. What will happen to the loving couple? We don't know about this. They will go to Tahiti, and that's all. So on Tahiti, we will have trouble between religious people and non-religious people. So they are not on their way to the ultimate romantic hideaway, as we might think, but to some kind of a center of severe crisis. So it's not paradise where they will end, maybe.
It's really interesting that there's a few ideas there. I'm reminded as well that around the same time in 1958, Huxley publishes Brave New World Revisited. So he is clearly in the space of looking upon the society of the 1950s versus that of the 1920s and 1930s and trying to see which of his predictions had come true. And living in America of the 1950s, he would have seen all those tendencies towards a shallow and disposable consumer culture just having accelerated in a post-war reconstruction. So I can see why he went to that level. And I also think that idea of poking fun at the musical audience, poking fun at their naivety and their quest for a good time has indeed become a part of the sort of trope of the genre. So musicals are often now quite subversive because that's what people go there to be. Almost, they go there to be delighted and to have fun, but they also go there to be shaken up a bit. They want to be criticized to some extent. So it's really interesting that's happening. And I just want to talk a bit about how the musical form allows that satire to happen, because as you said, to play that back, by using Renaissance leitmotifs for John and incorporating those into this world in which history is mostly banned and denied, he's almost calling to attention how our ideas of the way life should be in our utopias are really compromised by their reliance on all the stuff that we want to leave behind. Music works on the brain in a different way, doesn't it? It's more environmental. We can't choose not to listen to music in a way we can choose not to read. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think Huxley, for him, it was very important to have this fun and this poking fun on his own audience and all shallowness. That's really very important for him. And he has created funny songs in this musical to even, let's say, push the boundaries of fun in this this musical comedy. Yeah. Sometimes with misplaced words even.
Yeah. I really like this idea of Huxley as a real prophet of the use of musicality in satire and comedy, which is just such a big part of our culture now. That's really interesting.
For the second segment, I wanted to discuss something that doesn't really come up when we talk about Huxley's writing. We know that he was a novelist. We know that he was an opinion piece writer and journalist. He was a travel writer. But we don't really discuss Huxley's poetry that much in the field of Huxley studies, or indeed anywhere. It is interesting to note that Huxley did put out several volumes of poetry in the early years of his career, but he didn't really seem to stick with the form for very long at all. And his reputation as a poet is nowhere near as esteemed as that of his reputation as a novelist. Huxley did enjoy some limited early success with some of his poems. Some of the key collections of poems include The Burning Wheel, which was his first collection published in 1916, followed by Defeat of Youth in 1918, and Leda and Limbo, both collections published in 1920. While he did enjoy some moderate success with these poems, his early efforts were not always appreciated by his literary peers. Virginia Woolf, for example, wrote in the Times Literary Supplement that Huxley was better equipped with the vocabulary of a poet than with the inspiration of a poet. Very cutting remark. So quoting from Robin Hull's book, Aldous Huxley for Beginners, we might be able to understand a little bit more about why Huxley's poetry was less highly regarded by his literary peers. Hull writes, his early poetry was modern in content, but scrupulously traditional in form, as was his preference for the sonnet. This ran counter to the experimental trends in London at that time. For example, the imagism of Ezra Pound or Dadaism, which was gaining ground on the continent. Huxley's early poetic works employed modern stylistic devices such as free verse, though he never aspired to avant-gardism. Nevertheless, he was soon hailed as one of the leading post-World War I intellectuals and a merciless satirist. So it seems that Huxley was more drawn to ideas than he was necessarily drawn to poetic experimentation. And his appreciation for movements such as the French symbolist movement may have held him back from leaning too far into the more trendy avant-garde style of writing. But it seems fitting that if we're going to be discussing Huxley's poetry, I should actually at least read you a sample of his poetry so that you can decide for yourself whether or not he was or was not a good poet. I'll read you a couple from his collection Leda, published in 1920. The first is called The First Philosopher's Song. And it goes, a poor degenerate from the ape, whose hands are four, whose tail's a limb, I contemplate my flaccid shape, and know I may not rival him, save with my mind, a nimbler beast, possessing 1,000 sinewy tails, 1,000 hands with which it scales, greedy of luscious truth, the greased poles and the cocoa palms of thought, threads easily through the mangrove maze of metaphysics, walks the taut, frail, dangerous liana ways, that link across wide gulfs remote, analogies between tree and tree, outruns the hare, outthrops the goat, mind fabulous, mind sublime and free. But oh, the sound of simian mirth, mind issued from the monkey's womb, it's still umbilical to earth, earth its home, and earth its tomb. So that was the first philosopher's song. I think it compares quite interestingly to the fifth philosopher's song, which goes, a million spermatozoa, all of them alive, out of their cataclysm, but one poor Noah dare hope to survive. And among that billion minus one might have chanced to be Shakespeare, another Newton, a new Donne, but the one was me. Shame to have ousted your betters thus, taking ark while the others remained outside. Better for all of us, froward homunculus, if you'd quietly died. I think there's something quite humorous about these early poems, and I think it is interesting when you read this and reflect on Huxley's lineage, particularly his grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, who was closely associated with Darwin. There seems to be a lot of Darwinian imagery, and certainly the survival of the fittest analogy is quite strong in the Fifth Philosopher's Song. I think it's fascinating as well when you take these poems in the context of some of Huxley's thoughts about poetry. In his essay, The Subject Matter of Poetry, which was published as part of On the Margin in 1923, Huxley complained, and I'm reading here, the subject matter of the new poetry remains the same as that of the old. The old boundaries have not been extended. There would be real novelty in the new poetry if it had, for example, taken to itself any of the new ideas and astonishing facts with which the new science has endowed the modern world. There would be real novelty in it if it had worked out a satisfactory artistic method for dealing with abstractions. It has not. So I think to summarize, it is a really fascinating essay, but I think his position, or one of his positions, is that why should poetry not also be about the cutting edge and about ideas rather than about pure emotion? So whether we think Huxley was successful or not successful as a poet, I think that there's actually a lot more to be explored about this lesser known facet of his work.
In many ways, it's Ape and Essence that's the center of gravity of your study. It's a novel that has their own fully fledged fictional soundtrack from Wagner's Liebestod, to the Die Tumescence, a song. How does that deliberate, you could call it, misplacement of highbrow music in this grotesque setting? Maybe you can give us a bit of a plot summary so we understand, these listeners understand what kind of grotesque setting it is. How does the placement of that music work as a comic and critical device? And is there any significance to why Huxley chooses Wagner, for example, or goes for specific composers and works?
So the movie script, the film script of Ape and Essence, in the second part of the book, the first one is a little set in Hollywood. So it's set in post-apocalyptic Los Angeles. It's a complete wasteland, the ruins of LA, of course, of one of the most famous Hollywood places, so the Hollywood place, not one of the most famous ones. We will find a brutal society there in post-war Los Angeles. We have people who pray to Belial instead of God. We have the Church of Belial, oppressive structures, misogynic structures, and we have the problem, because it was an atomic war before, of mutation. And around the attempts to create a sane and healthy new generation of people, there is an annual mating season. On the one day, we have Belial Day, where babies are killed, sorry for that, for eugenic reasons. So the babies with too many mutations must be killed to secure a better genetic pool for the next generations. And it's a start of a short-term mating season to produce the next generation. And so you can imagine that the person who comes into this society as a stranger, namely Dr. Alfred Poole, a New Zealand biologist who got lost on his expedition. He is, of course, shocked when he sees what happened to Los Angeles and what kind of society he's finding. So this is the overall grotesque setting. And if we think of modern dystopian movies, maybe we would expect some brutal, exclusively composed music in the background, but not something like classical music like Wagner. And Huxley masterfully, sorry, I'm fan in this case, so he masterfully uses music by really famous composers and their works to illustrate selected scenes. So he has worked out an entire soundtrack. So we have music in the whole film script. So he describes music on any occasion, more or less explicitly, but mostly he uses music by composers he did not like. So that's a matter of fact. And he was no fan of Wagner's music. And that's why he thought the caterwauling around Belial Day and the mating season and all the sex that's happening would be accompanied best by the Liebestod from the opera Tristan and Isolde. And I think the comedy is, once again, for the more educated reader, because people who know Wagner's music and who know this famous Liebestod are aware of the fact that this music has some kind of religious implication. It shall show the transfiguration of Isolde united in death with her love Tristan. And okay, this can have to do something with sex, but Wagner imagined differently. For Wagner, it was like the most possible unity of two persons. And here it is in the act of making love and not more. So he reduces Wagner to the level of physical things and not to the metaphysical basis that the composer maybe intended. So that's one of the aspects why this is I think, hilarious and incredibly funny.
Yeah, and I think if I were to try to decode that satire a little bit, in Ape and Essence, we see as a result of technological development a society that has degenerated to this level of Satan worship and infanticide and the prioritization of these what we would see as an extreme of uncivilization, if you were to put it that way. And one of the points that Huxley makes is throughout the book is that our own sense of values, our own sense of culture is no protection against what might happen to us because the behavior within the society, for example, having a ceremony in which babies are sacrificed or murdered once a year, sounds very abhorrent to us, but it's normalized and in this society, and even the depiction of it, because we have Dr. Paul who has to watch it. Huxley even makes a point, doesn't he, that it's pretty horrible to watch the first few babies get murdered, but once you get used to it, it no longer has the same impact. And I think it's to relate this to the use of a soundtrack by these composers that he didn't like. You can tell me if I'm right or wrong on this because I'm no expert on it, but I would maybe think that his criticisms of Wagner would be around the fact that Wagner he's a bit of an anti-rationalist and he uses music that carries our emotions away with us or carries us on a wave of emotion and almost tries to suspend the critical faculty that we might have, much in the same way that a modern action film just carries us along with the action after action. And there are these universal archetypes that are left unchallenged. And I think the music that Huxley prefers is music that requires us to be critical, to think, to analyze structure. And so I think he's almost suggesting don't be fooled by the fact that you like this particular music and you think you're highbrow, because actually there's more to it than that. Culture on its own isn't a guarantee of anything. Culture can be anything. And he tells us that with this satirical story of a culture that's hard to imagine, of, Satan worshipping as being the main religion.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect, especially against the background that the Nazis in Germany were fans of Wagner's music and misused this music for their purpose. That's an interesting aspect I haven't thought about in that depth before. Thank you. So the soundtrack. So normalizing something is really something we see nowadays, of course. So I think in Ape and Essence, I don't know if Huxley's intention was to do the same like this or being entertaining somehow. And maybe he thought, when I'm writing something like this with apes at the beginning of the book, so at the novel we see the ape world before they cause the atomic catastrophe. He has the idea of a kind of vicious circle. So it's also a warning that history will repeat itself, which makes the book, let's say, so important for nowadays, isn't it? And it's what the Archvicar of the Church of Belial also repeats. He says, it's always the same thing. So people always want some power, they're hungry for power and for more and more. And Belial is happy about this because this will lead to hell or maybe the next nuclear explosion. We don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that probably takes us quite nicely to one of the other books, which is Island. Yeah. So this is seen as a non-satirical or positive utopia, and music once again is used extensively. It's used on a more day-to-day level. The people of Parla, they use music in some ways as the people of Brave New World use it. They use it for social conditioning. There's the orgy porgy chants in Brave New World. There's lots of different rhymes and little jingles, you could call them, that are used to remind people of the priorities of their society. And in Ireland, there's meditative chanting and also the use of this synthesis of Eastern kind of inspired traditions to do with spiritual experiences, but also inflected with Western culture, such as Bach and Will Farnaby's Bach-inspired moksha experience, which, as you said, has got to be one of the most phenomenal descriptions of a psychedelic experience. In fact, better even than a previous work that he'd done in Heaven and Hell and Doors of Perception. So we could see this as a shift from sound and music as having this destructive satirical role to being constructive. But I want to keep the focus on satire and irony, because there's still a lot of irony in Ireland as well. I feel Huxley's too much of a brat. He can't let anything go unironically. So what are the kind of ironies and satire that we see in Ireland, which is a more of a classically utopian work, as you could say?
So I think Huxley's approach was to present a positive utopia in the end, some counterpart to Brave New World and Ape and Essence. But he realized while writing it that it might be too much educating and not entertaining. And I think that's where all these ironies and little humorous moments come in, to make it more entertaining and interesting for the readers. If we think about some aspects, here we have the play in the novel Oedipus in Parla, which is also part of education, of course, because it shows how to behave properly and not have any problems with the relationship to parents, etc., etc. But he uses Handel music. This is one of the rare scenes where music is mentioned explicitly. And the death march of Saul is really nicely described in a puppetry where you imagine they are circling around because they have 5 puppets and they are coming like a huge crowd of mourning people. This is one of funny scenes. Or a sitar player, it's close to this scene, some pages before. So we have a sitar player singing a quite, let's say, a song also about eroticism and sex and relationships, because everything is easy to handle on Parla. They are all so relaxed, etc. Some boy-girl stuff, and he is singing it in a zeta style, and it comes so naturally and is still funny because it's a culture clash for Will Farnaby, of course, because he doesn't realize what he's listening to until he's explained, and he is astonished that people, let's say, accept it naturally. And of course, this is also part of Huxley's education, but the more interesting part of education, isn't it? Right.
Yeah, there's definitely a real role in Ireland for forms of cultural experience to have quite a satirical edge to them, including music and songs and performances, in order to allow the culture to be healthy. And I think what Huxley is trying to do by including this satirical, kind of slightly sharp-edged element in their culture, he's trying to demonstrate the opposite, which is in our societies, the probably the farthest we would go with a truly mass cultural experience like Taylor Swift would be a word like bittersweet. We don't really promote outright satire of our own society and difficult themes to the level of mass culture. Mass culture is almost quite anodyne. It's sweet tasting. It's not actually cutting to the core of things. And I suppose he's trying to say that this is the play, isn't it? Like, there is some stuff that's more critical and satirical, but that enables the Palanese to have lives which are actually much more saccharine and utopian than the ones that we have. We like to keep our bitterness in private and pretend that everything's okay in public. In Parla, it's okay to be satirical in public.
Yeah, that's true. And another important aspect, I think, is at the end of the novel, which is, of course, no very happy end, because we see the invasion of Parla by the neighbor island Rendang. But even these really fateful events for the island come with some satirical twist, because there is a Wurlitzer music box airing some marching music, and we have the future Raja of Parla speaking in a high voice to his people and shouting what will happen to the island. Of course, the invasion with military is not a fine thing, and shooting Dr. MacPhail is really the worst that can happen. But still, Huxley wanted to include something to think about, something connecting with modern USA lifestyle. So the Wurlitzer is some kind of epitome of American musical lifestyle and listening, I think. And so we have it here in this very last scene of Ireland, which is dramatic, sad, but also a little bit funny.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. There's always that touch of humor there. And it's really interesting how your book is highlighting that it's often music that plays a critical role in delivering that element of satire and complexity. I wanted to finish by talking to you of a paper that you gave at the most recent symposium of the Aldous Huxley Society in Florence, where you talked about a particular kind of voice known as the contralto, particular kind of singing voice, and a particular kind of, we have to say it is a particular kind of woman, which Huxley seemed to like mocking in his work. So I think this association of a voice with a body type and a gender to a contemporary viewer or listener may seem to be very edgy and potentially quite uncomfortable as a repeated target of your satire. I suppose for Huxley, this is not unusual at all because he's interested in things like Sheldon's taxonomy. So he does believe that our intellects and our personalities are reflected in our body types, as difficult as we might find that. So tell us more about this, because it was a really enjoyable and funny paper about this repeated figure in Huxley's work of this kind of almost like grotesque female contralto singer. Like, what is he referring to? And how can we relate that to any of the stuff that we find a bit grotesque and horrible in our society now?
Oh, wow. First of all, I'm really convinced that Huxley had no misogynic ideas behind the creation of those characters. I'm a little bit afraid, meanwhile, that people could really feel offended by this kind of humor I'm presenting in the book. So it was also not my intention to present Huxley the misogynist in my dissertation. What was so interesting in research of this voice pitch, so Huxley always characterizes voices in his entire works. So male, female, all of them. But especially he mentions the contralto voice pitch, which is the deep female voice, for all who don't know about this. Contralto singers have a very rich voice, really different from the light soprano or even mezzo soprano. So they are chosen for certain opera roles, for example. And this was my point, that I realized, why does he always write about these contraltos so much? So it starts with smaller remarks in the story Two or Three Graces, for example. He describes people going to a concert hall and there are contralto singers, as he says, fruitily hooting Schubert and Brahms. The lead, by the way, was a musical genre Huxley really detested. So he didn't like these songs anyway. Maybe it was too close to popular music for him. I don't know. And all these hooting contraltos had a negative connotation. But when it comes to character creation in his fiction, we realize it's always a type of, I'm sorry for that, rather obese and elderly women he's connecting with this kind of voice. And most of these women are not very likable. We have characters in his short stories that are not very nicely described. When having a massage, they are characterized as like a ripe persimmon, which is not very charming. And so all these characters, also the early characters, are always connected to something base and not very sympathetic. So we have a prostitute in Time Must Have a Stop who doesn't behave very friendly, and she has a contralto voice. And we have in the end the Rani, the most I think round character around the contraltos, who is also not a very benevolent woman, isn't it? So she has her plans for Parla. And in my book, I'm trying to trace all the contralto voices throughout his oeuvre, not only in his utopias. And in Ape and Essence, it's very interesting. We have this apish singer, a jazz, maybe in jazz style, he never specifies this, with the detumescent song. And she is also singing it in a contralto voice. And he has expressions like expiring bedroom contralto. So this voice has always erotic connotations and the connotation of something bad, unlikable, all the characteristical features he does not very much appreciate.
Yeah, it is really interesting that there's this theme throughout, and it does make me think that through looking at aspects like voice and musicality, and you're right that Huxley does absolutely really put a lot of effort into describing the nature of the sound. It's not just a word. For example, to use the example you actually gave, the Rani in Ireland manages to speak with capital letters. So he's really painting a picture of this very imperious, presumptive, and frankly annoying voice that she must have if she can speak with capital letters. And it makes me think that there's thinking of the musical theme. For example, if we think of a really complicated text like Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, where these leitmotifs enable us to detect characters, archetypes, figures, weaving their way through the text between different voices. And it's much the same in Huxley, isn't it? His work is almost, if you think something like Point Counterpoint, it almost has an avowedly fugue-like structure in which we're supposed to see these different types of voices intersecting. So I think it's a really interesting way to read the text, to understand that these aren't really psychologically real characters per se, they're archetypes doing certain work as part of this dramatic and musical performance.
Yes, and he doesn't want to denigrate all these elderly women, of course. For him, they comprise some certain features he needs for his stories, especially. And there are some real characters maybe he was inspired by. So Nancy Cunard was surprisingly a contralto, and
okay.
his former lover. And Lady Ottoline Morell, probably she was a contralto too, and all these shades of these women are reflected at least in some of his novels before he comes to describe all these later characters. It can also be a humorous appreciation of certain qualities, especially in his short stories in the 1950s. So they're not at all bad. So it's a differentiated view on all these women. And I'm sure I focused on this female voice pitch only, honestly. If one does some more research on male voices, one can probably also find all these humorous aspects, but not connected to a special voice pitch. That's what I found especially interesting. So I can't remember describing a male voice with characterizing it as a tenor or a baritone. So here we have to have a close look, of course.
Absolutely. And on that note, it probably leaves me only to thank you very much, Heike, for coming on the podcast I'm sure it's not an ebook reader, but to draw attention to the new book, which is available from Lit Verlag's website as a book and also as an ebook, which is the one I have here. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and best of luck with the book. And I look forward to more of our discussions in the future.
Thank you very much.